Today we're going to talk about cooking oils and heart health, and I want to be upfront with you right from the start. The cooking oil that has generated the most concern in recent research is partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, which contains trans fats. These are the oils that have been chemically modified to be solid at room temperature, and the evidence is clear that they increase heart attack risk. However, and this is important, these oils have already been largely removed from the food supply in the United States and many other countries. The FDA banned artificial trans fats in processed foods back in 2018, so unless you're using very old products or certain imported foods, you're probably not encountering these oils in significant amounts anymore. Now, there's also ongoing discussion about highly refined seed oils like soybean oil, corn oil, and canola oil, and whether these might contribute to heart disease. That evidence is much more complicated and much less clear-cut, and we're going to look at what the research actually shows, what the limitations are, and what this means for your kitchen. I've spent considerable time reviewing the published research on dietary fats and cardiovascular health, and I want to give you an accurate picture of where the science stands right now, including what we know, what we don't know, and where experts disagree. Before we dive in, I want to be clear that this is educational content. It's not medical advice, and it doesn't replace talking to your healthcare provider. Everyone's situation is different, so discuss any dietary changes with your doctor, especially if you have existing heart conditions, diabetes, or if you take medications that could be affected by dietary changes. Let me start by explaining how dietary fats relate to heart health, because this will help you understand why certain oils raise concerns. When you eat fat, it doesn't go directly into your arteries and clog them up like grease in a pipe. That's a common misconception. What actually happens is more complex. The fats you eat are broken down in your digestive system, absorbed into your bloodstream, and then reassembled and transported throughout your body. Your liver plays a major role in this process. Different types of fats affect your cholesterol levels in different ways. They also influence inflammation in your body, how your blood clots, and how your blood vessels function. All of these factors together contribute to your risk of heart attack and stroke. There are several main categories of fats in cooking oils. Saturated fats are typically solid at room temperature and come primarily from animal sources, though coconut oil and palm oil are plant-based saturated fats. Monounsaturated fats are liquid at room temperature and are found in olive oil, avocado oil, and certain nut oils. Polyunsaturated fats are also liquid at room temperature and include omega-6 fatty acids, found in most seed oils, and omega-3 fatty acids, found in fatty fish, flaxseed, and walnuts. Then there are trans fats, which are mostly artificial and created through a process called partial hydrogenation. This process takes liquid vegetable oils and adds hydrogen to make them solid and more shelf-stable. As we age, our cardiovascular system undergoes normal changes. Our arteries become less flexible, a process called arterial stiffness. The lining of our blood vessels, called the endothelium, becomes less responsive to signals that tell blood vessels to relax or contract. Our cholesterol levels tend to rise, particularly LDL cholesterol, often called bad cholesterol. These are normal aging processes, but they mean that our hearts and blood vessels become more sensitive to dietary factors that might promote inflammation or raise cholesterol further. This is why the question of which cooking oils to use becomes particularly relevant as we get older. Let's talk about the evidence on trans fats first, because this is where we have the strongest and clearest data. Trans fats raise LDL cholesterol, the type associated with increased heart disease risk, and they lower HDL cholesterol, the type associated with protection against heart disease. This double effect makes trans fats particularly harmful. A meta-analysis published in the British Medical Journal in 2015 examined data from multiple studies involving hundreds of thousands of participants. The researchers found that for every 2% increase in calories from trans fats, the risk of coronary heart disease increased by 23%. That's a substantial effect. The evidence was strong enough that health organizations around the world, including the American Heart Association and the World Health Organization, called for the elimination of artificial trans fats from the food supply. As I mentioned, The FDA banned them in the United States in 2018, and most food manufacturers had already phased them out before that deadline. Now, here's where you need to be careful. The ban applies to artificial trans fats in processed foods, but it doesn't cover everything. Some imported foods may still contain them. Old products in your pantry that are past their best-by date might contain them if they were manufactured before the phase-out. And there are naturally occurring trans fats in small amounts in meat and dairy products, but these natural trans fats don't appear to have the same harmful effects as industrial trans fats. If you're looking at ingredient labels, the term you want to avoid is partially hydrogenated oil. Fully hydrogenated oils don't contain trans fats, and neither do non-hydrogenated oils. Now let's move to the more complicated question, which is about commonly used vegetable oils like soybean oil, corn oil, sunflower oil, and canola oil. These are often called seed oils or vegetable oils, and they're what most people use for everyday cooking. There's significant debate in the nutrition community about whether these oils contribute to heart disease or other health problems. Let me walk you through what the evidence shows and where the uncertainties lie. These oils are high in polyunsaturated fats, particularly omega-6 fatty acids. For decades, mainstream nutrition advice has been that polyunsaturated fats are heart-healthy, particularly when they replace saturated fats. This recommendation was based on studies showing that when people replaced saturated fats from butter and animal fats with polyunsaturated fats from vegetable oils, their LDL cholesterol levels decreased. Since high LDL cholesterol is associated with increased heart disease risk, the logic was that lowering LDL through diet would reduce heart attacks. Some controlled trials did show this benefit. The Finland Mental Hospital study from the 1960s and 70s found that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats reduced heart disease deaths. The Oslo Diet Heart study from the same era showed similar results. However, more recent reanalyses of older data and some newer studies have raised questions. A reanalysis of the Minnesota coronary experiment, published in the British Medical Journal in 2016, looked at data from a study conducted in the 1960s and 70s that had never been fully published. This study randomly assigned over 9,000 participants to either a diet high in vegetable oils or a diet higher in saturated fats. The researchers found that while the vegetable oil group did have lower cholesterol, they didn't have lower rates of death from heart disease. In fact, there was a trend toward higher mortality in the vegetable oil group, though this didn't reach statistical significance. The authors noted that the study had limitations, including the fact that many participants didn't stick with their assigned diets for very long. Another concern that's been raised is about the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in modern diets. Most seed oils are very high in omega-6 fatty acids and contain little to no omega-3 fatty acids. Some researchers have suggested that a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio might promote inflammation, which could contribute to heart disease. However, the evidence for this theory in humans is mixed. Some studies have found associations between higher omega-6 intake and inflammation markers, while others have not. A systematic review published in Circulation in 2014 concluded that omega-6 fatty acids do not appear to increase inflammation markers in controlled feeding studies. The processing of these oils is another area of concern. Most commercial vegetable oils undergo significant processing, including heating to high temperatures, treatment with chemical solvents, bleaching, and deodorizing. Critics argue that this processing can create oxidized fats and other potentially harmful compounds. There's some evidence from animal studies that heavily oxidized fats can promote atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of plaque in arteries. However, the amount of oxidized fats in commercially processed oils and whether they cause harm at typical consumption levels in humans is still debated. Here's what makes this complicated. Most of the long-term studies looking at vegetable oil consumption are observational, meaning researchers track what people eat naturally rather than assigning them to specific diets. In observational studies, people who use more vegetable oil might differ from people who use less in many ways. They might exercise more, smoke less, eat more vegetables, or have better access to healthcare. Researchers try to control for these factors statistically, but it's difficult to account for everything. The randomized controlled trials, which are better at showing cause and effect, are often shorter in duration or have other limitations. So where does this leave us? The mainstream position, supported by organizations like the American Heart Association, is that replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats, including polyunsaturated fats from vegetable oils, is beneficial for heart health. They point to the body of evidence showing that this replacement lowers LDL cholesterol and that most large studies show either neutral or beneficial effects on heart disease outcomes. However, there's a growing group of researchers and clinicians who question this recommendation. They point to studies like the Minnesota Coronary Experiment reanalysis and argue that LDL cholesterol reduction alone may not tell the whole story. They suggest that factors like inflammation, oxidative stress, and the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio may be important. What I think is important for you to understand is that this is an area of active scientific debate. The evidence is not settled. Different experts looking at the same data reach different conclusions, in part because they weigh different types of evidence differently, and in part because the available studies have limitations. This is actually normal in nutrition science. Diet is complex. People are complex, and it's very difficult to run perfect studies of dietary interventions over many years. Given this uncertainty, what should you actually do in your kitchen? Let me give you some practical guidance based on what we know, what we don't know, and what seems most likely to be beneficial or at least unlikely to cause harm. If you have old bottles of partially hydrogenated oil or products containing partially hydrogenated oils, it makes sense to discard them. The evidence against trans fats is strong and consistent. For everyday cooking, olive oil is a good choice when you need oil. It's high in monounsaturated fats, and there's strong evidence from Mediterranean diet studies that olive oil consumption is associated with better cardiovascular outcomes. Extra virgin olive oil also contains polyphenols, which are plant compounds with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. You can use olive oil for most cooking purposes. The idea that you can't cook with olive oil because it has a low smoke point is somewhat overstated. Regular olive oil has a smoke point around 410 degrees Fahrenheit, which is fine for most home cooking, including sautéing. Extra virgin olive oil has a slightly lower smoke point, around 375 degrees, but it's still suitable for most cooking that isn't extremely high heat. If you need an oil for very high heat cooking, avocado oil is a good option. It has a high smoke point around 520 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's also high in monounsaturated fats similar to olive oil. It's more expensive than some other options, but you don't need to use it for everything, just for the cooking methods that require very high heat. For baking or other uses where you need a neutral flavor, you could choose canola oil or avocado oil. Canola oil has a better fatty acid profile than soybean or corn oil because it's lower in omega-6 fatty acids and contains some omega-3 fatty acids. It's also less processed than some other vegetable oils if you choose organic or cold-pressed versions. If you want to minimize your use of highly processed seed oils as a precautionary approach, that's reasonable given the uncertainties in the evidence. You could cook with olive oil, avocado oil, or even small amounts of butter or ghee for certain purposes. Butter is high in saturated fat, so using large amounts probably isn't ideal, but using a small amount for flavor in the context of an otherwise healthy diet is unlikely to cause problems. Some people also use coconut oil. Coconut oil is high in saturated fat, but it's a specific type of saturated fat that includes medium-chain triglycerides. Some preliminary research suggests that coconut oil might not raise cardiovascular risk as much as other saturated fats, but the evidence is still limited and somewhat contradictory. If you enjoy the flavor of coconut oil and want to use it occasionally, that's probably fine, but I wouldn't recommend using it as your primary cooking fat based on current evidence. Now, here's something important. The type of oil you use for cooking is just one piece of your overall diet and lifestyle. If you're eating a lot of fried foods, highly processed foods, and refined carbohydrates, switching from soybean oil to olive oil isn't going to dramatically change your health outcomes. On the other hand, if you're eating plenty of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lean proteins, and fish, and you're physically active and maintaining a healthy weight, the specific cooking oil you use probably makes a relatively small difference. Context matters. Let me also address what you might see when you're buying packaged foods. Many processed foods contain soybean oil, canola oil, or other vegetable oils. These oils are cheap and shelf-stable, which is why food manufacturers use them. If you want to minimize your consumption of these oils, you'll need to read ingredient labels and choose products that use olive oil or avocado oil instead, or cook more meals from scratch using whole ingredients and the oils you choose. This can be more expensive and time-consuming, so you'll need to decide what trade-offs make sense for your situation. Some people take the approach of focusing on mostly whole foods and not worrying too much about small amounts of vegetable oils in occasional processed foods. One more consideration is how you use your cooking oil. Repeatedly heating oil to high temperatures, especially to the point where it smokes, can create oxidized fats and other compounds that may be harmful. If you're deep frying, don't reuse oil many times. If oil starts smoking while you're cooking, it's too hot, and you should lower the temperature. Store your oils in a cool, dark place rather than next to the stove where they're exposed to heat and light, which can cause oxidation. Buy oils in quantities you'll use within a few months rather than buying huge containers that will sit for a year. Now let me be clear about when you should talk to a doctor. If you have existing heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes, or other cardiovascular risk factors, it's worth having a conversation with your healthcare provider or a registered dietitian about your overall dietary pattern, including the fats and oils you're consuming. They can give you personalized recommendations based on your specific health situation and your lab results. If you're on medications for cholesterol or blood pressure, dietary changes can sometimes affect how well these medications work or whether the dose needs adjustment, so it's important to keep your doctor informed about significant dietary changes you make. If you experience chest pain, shortness of breath, unusual fatigue, or other symptoms that might indicate heart problems, those are reasons to seek medical attention regardless of what oil you've been cooking with. These symptoms need to be evaluated to determine their cause, and if you're thinking about making major dietary changes, especially if you have health conditions or take medications, checking with your doctor first is always a good idea. Let me bring this together for you. The cooking oil with the clearest evidence of increasing heart attack risk is partially hydrogenated oil containing trans fats, and these have largely been removed from the food supply already. For commonly used vegetable oils like soybean oil and corn oil, the evidence about their effects on heart disease risk is mixed and debated among experts. The safest recommendation based on current evidence is to use oils high in monounsaturated fats, particularly olive oil, as your primary cooking fat. Avocado oil is another good option. If you choose to use small amounts of butter or coconut oil for flavor or specific cooking purposes, that's probably fine in the context of an overall healthy diet. Minimizing highly processed seed oils is a reasonable precautionary approach given the uncertainties, but remember that your overall dietary pattern matters more than any single ingredient. The most important things you can do for heart health go beyond cooking oil choice. Eating plenty of vegetables and fruits, choosing whole grains over refined grains, including fatty fish in your diet regularly for omega-3 fatty acids, limiting added sugars and highly processed foods, maintaining a healthy weight, staying physically active, not smoking, and managing stress all have strong evidence supporting their benefits for cardiovascular health. The type of cooking oil you use is one factor among many, and it's worth getting right, but it's not the only factor or even necessarily the most important factor. If you found this information helpful, subscribing to this channel helps me continue creating evidence-based content about health topics that matter to adults over 50. Sharing this video with someone who might benefit from understanding the nuance around cooking oils helps spread accurate information in an area where there's a lot of fear-mongering and oversimplification. If you have questions or topics you'd like me to cover in future videos, leave them in the comments. I read them and use them to plan upcoming content. And remember, this is educational content to help you make informed decisions. For advice specific to your health situation, talk with your healthcare provider who knows your complete medical history. Thanks for watching. and I'll see you in the next video.